For climbers on Mount Everest, the summit is never the most dangerous part of the journey. The real danger begins after the summit. During the descent, when exhaustion sets in, weather shifts without warning, and the margin for survival becomes dangerously thin. Because of that reality, experienced expedition leaders follow one rule above all others: the turnaround time. The turnaround time is simple and absolute. If climbers have not reached the summit by a specific hour, usually around 2 in the afternoon, they must turn around immediately, no matter how close the summit appears. It does not matter how much money has been spent, how much effort has been invested, or how near the top may seem. When the turnaround time arrives, the climb ends. The rule exists because Everest has a long history of climbers reaching the summit too late in the day, only to die during the descent. Above 8,000 meters, the region known as the death zone, the human body is slowly deteriorating. Oxygen levels are dangerously low. Judgment becomes impaired. Every step requires immense effort. The longer a climber remains there, the more likely small problems turn into fatal ones. In the spring of 1996, one of the most experienced guides on Everest was preparing to lead another expedition to the summit. His name was Rob Hall. Hall was not a reckless climber chasing glory. By the mid-1990s, he had already climbed Everest 5 times, more than any other non-Sherpa climber at the time. His reputation in the mountaineering world was built on discipline, organization, and strict adherence to safety rules. Clients trusted him precisely because he was known for enforcing those rules, even when it meant turning back just short of the summit. For Rob Hall, the turnaround time was not just a guideline. It was the line between a successful expedition and a fatal mistake. But on May 10th, 1996, that line would begin to blur. And once the clock on Everest begins to slip, the mountain rarely gives climbers a second chance. Rob Hall grew up in Christchurch, New Zealand, within sight of the rugged peaks of the Southern Alps. From an early age, he was drawn to the mountains, and by his 20s, he had already developed a reputation as one of the strongest climbers in the country. In 1989, he met fellow New Zealand climber Gary Ball, and the two quickly formed one of the most successful climbing partnerships of their generation. Together, they pursued ambitious objectives around the world, including an extraordinary achievement: climbing the highest mountain on each continent, the 7 summits, in just 7 months. Their success made international headlines and established both men as elite mountaineers. But Hall and Ball saw an opportunity beyond personal climbing achievements. In the early 1990s, interest in climbing Everest was growing rapidly. Wealthy clients from around the world were willing to pay large sums for the chance to stand on the highest point on Earth. Recognizing that demand, the two climbers founded a guiding company that would eventually become Adventure Consultants. The concept was straightforward. Experienced guides would lead paying clients safely to the summit of Everest. At the time, a guided Everest expedition could cost around $65,000, an enormous amount of money in the early 1990s. Clients expected professionalism, organization, and above all, a high probability of success. Hall delivered exactly that. By the mid-1990s, Adventure Consultants had guided dozens of climbers to the summit. Hall had personally led 39 clients to the top of Everest. His expeditions were known for careful logistics, strong Sherpa support, and strict decision-making when conditions deteriorated. In fact, the year before the disaster, Hall had forced an entire group of clients to turn around near the summit because heavy snow made the descent too dangerous. The decision frustrated some of the climbers, but it reinforced Hall's reputation as a guide who would prioritize safety over success. Ironically, that reputation would make the events of 1996 even more difficult for the climbing community to understand. Because the man who had built his career on disciplined decision-making would ultimately find himself facing the very rule he had always enforced. And on that day, the rule would not hold. The 1996 Everest climbing season was unusually crowded. Commercial expeditions had grown increasingly popular, and multiple teams were attempting the summit during the same narrow window of stable weather. Among them was another well-known guide, Scott Fisher, who led a competing expedition through his company, Mountain Madness. Both teams were climbing the standard route from the south side of Everest, approaching from Nepal through a series of camps that gradually carried climbers higher up the mountain. From base camp, they moved through the dangerous Khumbu Icefall to Camp 2 in the western Khwam. From there, they climbed the steep Lot's Face to Camp 3. Finally, they established Camp 4 on the South Col at approximately 8,000 meters. Above Camp 4 lies the death zone. At that altitude, the human body begins to deteriorate rapidly. The air contains roughly 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level. Climbers must rely on bottled oxygen and move slowly to conserve energy. Summit attempts are carefully timed to minimize the hours spent in this lethal environment. Expeditions typically leave Camp 4 around midnight, climbing through the darkness so that they can reach the summit in the late morning. That schedule allows enough daylight and strength for the descent. But the success of that strategy depends entirely on one factor: time. Every hour spent above 8,000 meters increases the danger, which is why the turnaround time exists. And on May 10th, 1996, that schedule would begin to unravel almost immediately. Shortly after midnight, climbers from several expeditions began their summit push from Camp 4. Among Rob Hall's clients was Doug Hansen, a postal worker from Seattle who had attempted Everest with Hall the previous year, but had been forced to turn back just short of the summit. For Hansen, the 1996 expedition represented redemption. But as the climbers moved upward through the darkness, the expedition encountered an unexpected problem. The fixed ropes that were supposed to be installed along key sections of the route had not yet been placed. Fixed ropes are essential on Everest. They allow climbers to clip into a safety line while ascending steep terrain, particularly near the summit where the slopes become exposed and technically demanding. Without them, progress slows dramatically. Guides and Sherpas had to stop and install the ropes while climbers waited in line high on the mountain. Those delays created a bottleneck near one of Everest's most famous obstacles, the Hillary Step, a steep rock formation just below the summit ridge. Because only one climber could pass the obstacle at a time, a long line formed along the ridge. More than 30 climbers were attempting the summit that day. One by one, they waited their turn. And as they waited, the clock continued to move toward the turnaround time. By late morning on May 10th, the expedition schedule was already slipping. Climbers who should have been nearing the summit were still stalled below the Hillary Step. Others were moving far more slowly than expected, exhausted from the thin air and long delays. Under normal circumstances, this would have triggered a simple decision: turn around. Expedition leaders enforce the turnaround time precisely because delays like this occur. The rule is designed to protect climbers from exactly this scenario, a summit push that takes longer than expected. But the summit was close, very close. From the upper ridge, climbers could see the final snow slope leading to the top of Everest. For many of them, the summit represented the culmination of years of preparation and enormous financial investment. Turning around within sight of the top is one of the most psychologically difficult decisions a climber can make. For guides, the situation is even more complicated. Clients depend on them not only for safety, but also for success. And on May 10th, the temptation to continue upward proved stronger than the discipline of the clock. The turnaround time passed, but climbers continued climbing. Eventually, several climbers reached the summit of Everest that afternoon, but the summit was being reached dangerously late. For Rob Hall and Doug Hansen, the situation was especially critical. Hansen had struggled throughout the ascent, and by the time they reached the summit ridge, he was already severely fatigued. Nevertheless, Hansen eventually stood on the summit of Everest. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also late, far too late. The descent from the summit would now take place under conditions that the turnaround rule was designed to prevent: extreme fatigue, limited oxygen, and rapidly changing weather. As the climbers began descending, clouds moved across the summit ridge and winds intensified. Snow began to fall, the mountain was changing, and the climbers were still far from safety. Doug Hansen collapsed during the descent. Exhausted and out of oxygen, he could no longer continue moving down the mountain. Rob Hall stayed with him. For guides on Everest, abandoning a client is almost unthinkable. The entire premise of commercial guiding is that clients trust their guide with their lives. But remaining at extreme altitude carries its own risk. Every hour spent above 8,000 meters weakens the body further. As a storm swept across the upper slopes of Everest, climbers descending toward Camp 4 struggled to navigate through whiteout conditions. Some became disoriented in the storm and collapsed in the snow. Others survived only because teammates ventured back into the blizzard to search for them. High above them, Rob Hall remained stranded near the south summit. Doug Hansen had died, and the window for escape had closed. Through the night and into the next morning, Rob Hall remained in radio contact with base camp. He had severe frostbite, and his oxygen regulator had frozen with ice. At one point, he reported that fellow guide Andy Harris had reached him during the night, but Harris later disappeared on the mountain and was never seen again. Rescue attempts were impossible. The storm made climbing toward Hall suicidal. Eventually, Hall requested a satellite phone call to his wife, Jan Arnold, who was waiting at home in New Zealand. The two spoke briefly. Hall told her he was comfortable and asked her not to worry. It was the final conversation they would ever have. Rob Hall died high on Everest on May 11th, 1996. In the years that followed, the events of May 10 and 11, 1996 were examined repeatedly by climbers, historians, and expedition leaders. The disaster involved many contributing factors: overcrowding on the mountain, missing fixed ropes, deteriorating weather, and the brutal physiological effects of extreme altitude. But again and again, one element returned to the center of the analysis: the turnaround time. The rule exists because Everest punishes delay. Climbers must reach the summit early enough to descend before exhaustion, darkness, and storms take control of the mountain. On May 10th, that rule was broken. Climbers were still ascending well past the 2 o'clock deadline. Guides allowed summit pushes to continue despite the slipping schedule. By the time many climbers reached the top, the margin of safety had already disappeared. When the storm arrived later that afternoon, climbers were still scattered high above the South Col, too far from camp, too exhausted to move quickly, and too late to escape the weather closing in around them. Rob Hall had built his reputation on discipline and timing, but on that day, the most important rule on Everest failed. And when the turnaround time fails, the mountain decides the rest. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more mountaineering stories at fatal altitude.